As most of you are probably aware, last weekend was Star Wars Celebration, and considering it was in London this year, I am severely kicking myself for not getting tickets. Anyway, because of all the buzz from last weekend, it had me wanting to do a video related to Star Wars, but trying to pick something specific that's Star Wars related to do a video on proved a lot trickier than I was expecting, because part of me was like, oh, I could do a video on The Mandalorian, but I haven't caught up with Season 3 yet, so that kind of seems a bit pointless. I could have done a video ranking all the Star Wars films, but even that seems like something that's kind of been overdone. Or I could have even done a video talking about some of the Star Wars shows from last year, like Andor or the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, but in hindsight, if I was to do a video on them, I would have already done it by now. So trying to choose something was proving rather tricky. But then it clicked with me, and there is something Star Wars related that I absolutely love, that I've been wanting to talk about for years on this channel, but haven't really found the right avenue or reason to bring it up in a video. Until now. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite Star Wars related things ever made, and I'm really annoyed it's not canon anymore. I am of course talking about the 2003 Star Wars micro-series by Genndy Tartakovsky, simply titled Star Wars Clone Wars. Not Star Wars The Clone Wars, just Star Wars Clone Wars. I have had these two DVDs since they were released in 2004, and I've watched them to death. Like, I feel as if I've watched these two volumes of Star Wars Clone Wars more than any other Star Wars related thing ever. And yes, part of that is to do with nostalgia. I remember seeing a couple of the chapters playing every now and then on Cartoon Network, and it had me intrigued to watch the whole thing, hence why I ended up buying the two DVDs. And once you watch the whole thing from start to finish, it does feel better as a more complete viewing experience rather than just watching chapters intermittently on Cartoon Network. There are 25 chapters in total, and on their own they're about like 10 to 15 minutes each, but if you watch volumes 1 and 2 back to back, it comes in at roughly just under 2 hours, so it does feel like a more complete experience if you watch the entire thing from start to finish. And to be honest, every time I watch Star Wars Clone Wars, I prefer watching it that way anyway. Now, there are many reasons other than nostalgia as to why I love Star Wars Clone Wars. One of those main reasons being the animation. For those of you that may not be familiar with the name Genndy Tartakovsky, who is the creator of this micro-series, he is the creator of Samurai Jack and Dexter's Laboratory. So off of knowing that, you kind of get an idea of what the animation style of this show is going to be like. And if I was to compare Star Wars Clone Wars to any of his previous shows, it's probably more similar to Samurai Jack than anything else. Now, I'm going to be honest, but when I was a kid, I didn't really watch much of Dexter's Laboratory or Samurai Jack. To be honest, I don't even think I knew what Samurai Jack was until much later on. But I think the reason I didn't watch Dexter's Laboratory was partly because the animation style took a bit of getting used to. But that was for that show. For some reason with Star Wars Clone Wars, this specific animation style just sort of works immediately, and I really don't know why. I don't know what about the style didn't work for me for Dexter's Laboratory, but immediately clicks for this. The show manages to blend that very angular animation style from Genndy Tartakovsky's other work, along with that very quick, fast-paced, action-oriented approach that you have seen in his other shows, such as Samurai Jack. And for me, those are the two reasons why this show shines: the animation and the pacing. Even though you've got 25 chapters here spread out over 2 volumes, the whole thing goes by incredibly quickly because the pacing of this show is relentless. From the moment chapter 1 starts to the moment the 25th chapter ends, you are just on a roller coaster of a ride, and the pacing never gives up for the entire thing. You do get a couple of quiet moments with specific characters, but even those feel very short-lived, and a lot of this micro-series is just action. Now, I know that might sound as if it doesn't really have much depth, But then that's where the other praise of this show comes in, and that it excels in visual storytelling. Even though you only get one or two quiet moments here and there, and throughout the whole thing there really is not that much dialogue. There is quite a bit in a few segments, but like I said, the majority of the thing is visual storytelling, and that's why I love this show so much. Because even during some of the most hectic action set pieces throughout the show, it still manages to tell these miniature stories through those set pieces in a way that is purely visual, and I absolutely love that about this show, and I don't think it would work as well as it does if it wasn't for this unique animation style. For example, there is this incredible fight scene between Mace Windu and an entire army of battle droids, and at first it does seem rather over the top, and to be honest, a lot of the fights in the show are very over the top. But that fight scene alone manages to tell its own miniature story. He starts off overpowering a lot of the battle droids, but then he loses his lightsaber and the battle becomes even harder, and he ends up having to use his fists and the Force and his sheer wit to try and outmaneuver these battle droids and win. And the way that miniature story develops is really fascinating, and you get a lot of that with almost every single set piece in the series. Another great example is when Obi-Wan and an army of clone troopers attack this city that is overrun by separatist forces. Now, rather than focusing on the battle that is happening just outside of the city, what some of the chapters do specifically is focus on this elite team of clone troopers that have gone in around the back of the city and are kind of in their own little skirmish to try and get to these artillery cannons to try and stop them and blow them up. I also love some of the characters this show introduced, as well as the characters that it brings back from the main films as well. For instance, if it wasn't for this micro-series, then we wouldn't have Asajj Ventress, which thankfully was brought back in Star Wars The Clone Wars, because she is a very interesting character, and even though she feels like she doesn't have much to do in this micro-series, she is still a fascinating character that you want to see more of. Almost like what they did with Darth Maul in Episode 1. He wasn't there for much of the runtime, but what he was there for had you intrigued and had you wanting to see more of that character, and they do a brilliant job with doing that with Asajj Ventress's character. You also have this mutant bounty hunter character, which is simply just called Dirge. And at first he seems very one-note, as if he's just this big tank-like bounty hunter guy who's working for the Separatists, and Obi-Wan has to take him out. But then he regenerates and becomes this like liquid sludge monster that just doesn't want to die, and even that just makes him more interesting than being the muscle that the Separatists have hired. The fact that he just keeps coming back, and the fact that he just keeps regenerating after every hit he takes, makes him a lot more interesting, and again, you want to know more about him. And of course, this show was the very first time that we saw General Grievous on screen, and his introduction in this show, like you've probably heard many people say before, is one of the best character introductions, full stop. His introduction and presence in this micro-series is so intimidating and menacing that by the time you get to Revenge of the Sith, he just becomes this very lackluster character where all the potential has just gone out the window. Honestly, if you went straight from Attack of the Clones to Revenge of the Sith, and Revenge of the Sith was your first introduction to General Grievous, which I presume it was for a lot of people at the time, then it must have been very underwhelming just having him come through some doors coughing his guts up. Whereas in Star Wars Clone Wars, he immediately crushes one Jedi by just landing straight on him, and then takes out about 5 or 6 Jedi all at once, on his own. That is the introduction you're given to him, and it is so much more menacing than what we got in Revenge of the Sith. There is also one thing that this show does really well, and I'm really glad that they kind of picked up on it and ran with this sort of thing in Star Wars The Clone Wars as well, and that's by giving very minor characters in the main films more to do in this series. For example, one of the very early chapters in this micro series purely focuses on a Jedi called Kit Fisto, which in the films you see once in Attack of the Clones, and then you see him once very briefly in Revenge of the Sith before he's killed by Palpatine. That's all he gets to do in the prequels. But in Star Wars Clone Wars, he gets an entire chapter to himself where he kicks ass underwater. And I just immediately loved that scene, and the fact that it gave these smaller characters a lot more to do is really interesting. And like I said, I'm really glad that Star Wars The Clone Wars took that approach and ran with it, giving all these side characters a lot more to do as the war went on. I used to think Star Wars Clone Wars was one of the most underrated Star Wars things that had ever been made, but thankfully now that more people have gone back to revisit it or watch it for the first time, it's starting to gain a bit more of a following, and people can see just how great this little micro series really was. For instance, if it wasn't for this series, we probably wouldn't have had The Clone Wars, which took the core concept of this show but just developed it and gave it room to breathe, because obviously they had a lot more episodes and seasons to work with, whereas this was just restricted to 2 volumes and 25 chapters. But with all that being said, Star Wars Clone Wars will forever be one of my favourite Star Wars related things to have ever been made. Whether you're looking at the comics or the video games or the films, Star Wars Clone Wars just holds a special place in my heart because of what it was able to do and really captivate me as a young Star Wars fan. Because for those of you that don't know, when I was a kid, I wasn't as into Star Wars as I am now. It wasn't until seeing The Force Awakens in the cinema where everything sort of just clicked. And that's not to say that I didn't like Star Wars as a kid. I did like some of the films, etc. But Star Wars Clone Wars was one of the first times I watched something that was Star Wars related and suddenly went, oh my god, this is the coolest thing ever. If you've seen the Clone Wars micro series from 2003, please let me know in the comments what you think about it. I personally love it, as you've heard me say throughout this video, but I would love to hear what you think about it in the comments below. Like the video if you haven't done so already, and subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this in the future. Bye.